for doing it. Yeah, Mr. Babbage is cool. All right. Let's start talking about stuff. All right. Thing number one, thanks for those of you who emailed me. I think I emailed a couple of you back this morning. I'll email a couple more after class. So I really, yeah, if you've turned in stuff and I haven't graded it, um, I'll grade it today. Whether you told me why you turned it in late or not, why you turned it in late helps me a little bit. There are a couple of you that emails like, I haven't turned stuff in yet, but I'm going to do it. Just do it. Just turn it in. Okay. Just turn it in. But yeah, if you're turning in stuff a couple weeks late, you can't expect full credit because that wouldn't be reasonable because everybody else, many other people, most other people, turn in the stuff on time. So you gotta pay the price a little if you're behind, but so turn your stuff in. That'll make it easier for me to grade. For those of you who's like, I turned it in, you gave me a 1, that I gave you the 1, because I can't open it. And if you can't resubmit it, it's such a pain for me, but I don't know what to tell you. I don't know how to fix it. So I guess send it in an email and then I'll be cranky while I grade it. But send it in an email, at least I'll grade it, right? So there you go. And it's not so much that I will be cranky. I'm not lying about that. But it's just, I gotta have too many things open at the same time and I can't look at it and the rubric at the same time. You know what I'm saying? It's just easier if you can do it the original way. So I don't know why it works the way it does for some of you, and for everybody else it works fine. I got no clue. So if I did, I would tell you, but I don't, so I won't. All right, let's look at the Unit 4 questions. And hopefully yesterday's recording was okay-ish and didn't have the first part where I don't even remember what I was talking about. The early part of class. I think that's where I was talking to the computer because I couldn't get it to work. Today's question, which I predict many of you will answer, was Reconstruction a success or failure, something in between? In your response, think about land policy, key legislation during presidential radical Reconstruction, that is the post-Lincoln, the Johnson, the military Reconstruction thing, Southern politics, racial and political violence, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. Be sure, sorry that I'm not reading well, be sure to make clear what you mean by success and failure. Okay, so usually when you have a question like this, yes or no, good or bad, failure or success, you know that it's some of each. You know that, right? So for this one, and we'll probably talk about this at the end, as far as success or failure, it's got to be some of both, my opinion. You don't always have to agree with me. You don't ever have to agree with me, unless I'm right. No, you never have to agree with me. But the success part, you're going to notice in this chapter, there are going to be some things that are fairly cool that happen. There are going to be some historically Black colleges that are started. There's going to be African Americans serving in the legislature. You're going to see Sojourner Truth working with the Freedmen's Bureau. You're going to see Frederick Douglass continuing to advise in some capacities. You're going to see small number of African Americans doing incredibly well. You've got Booker T. Washington starting Tuskegee. There's stuff that happens that's undeniably positive. Yeah. And also some amendments, 13, 14, and 15. Those are crucial. Yeah, you should know those for the quiz as well. But those are really, really important. They are. And even though you'll notice pretty quickly the United States government does not do a very reasonable job enforcing those amendments, it creates a foundation. This seems to be the story of the United States and civil rights. It creates a foundation that later on will be used. I know. But it's used briefly, and then the U.S. government says, kidding. And then about 80 years later, we go, not kidding. Yeah, kind of how that works. So there are some really good positive things that happen there's some not so positive things that happen. And then eventually the US government, neither party wants to really enforce Reconstruction, doesn't really care so much about equality again for a long time. So during this era, and you hear this sometimes in political discussions, it is the Republican Party that is in favor of Reconstruction, that wants to push for equality, that sort of thing. No doubt, there's no question about it. That's Republicans. That's, Abraham Lincoln, that sort of thing. Later on, during the civil rights movement, in the initial part of it, it's weird. On a national level, it's Republican or it's Democrats. And we're talking way later on, 1940s, 50s, 60s. The Democrats will be the first to put civil rights into their party platform, but the entire South, white South, is also Democratic. So they're not exactly pro-civil rights. So, all of the governors who really push back on school integration, those guys are Democrats as well. So it gets really, it gets complicated in the modern era about who's more pro-civil rights, Democrats or Republicans, because on the national party level, it's Democrats. On the day-to-day, let's fix stuff level, statewide, in the Congress as well, it's Republicans. But then when you have a president who finally, the presidents who really take action tend to be Democrats. And it goes against what the southern part of their party wants. So that's why, too, when you hear the modern political parties go like, we're the party of civil rights, it's like, yes and no for both Republicans and Democrats. They're both the party of civil rights and they're both not the party of civil rights in the modern era. In this era we're talking about, it's Republican. There aren't any Democrats that it's Republicans in this era. It's the party of Lincoln. But in the modern era, yeah, it's complicated. Isn't everything complicated politically in the modern era? Politics. They're important though. Timed question review. Let's see. Oh, that's right. I had 1301 and 1302 version. So I can't remember. We talked about all the stuff we needed to talk about before. Reconstruction, I don't remember if we talked about that in the Lincoln yesterday, but we'll bring that up in the notes today if we missed it. And second inaugural, that's your document thing. So a couple of you've turned that in already. And I will probably, I think tonight, well, maybe this afternoon, but it might be later tonight when I grade. So I'll grade some today, and then I'll probably grade some more Friday evening. And then I'll try to get caught up on all your stuff Saturday afternoon, because my grades are due pretty quickly. Hey, and I'm not kidding about that grade thing. Those grades are due Tuesday. Please don't turn stuff in really, 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 really late. Try to have it all turned in by Monday if you're behind on stuff. Most of you have been outstanding, really, about getting stuff in a timely fashion. Maybe more outstanding than I've been about grading stuff in a timely fashion. So I appreciate that. Some of you, yeah. So if you're one of those people that likes to turn stuff in 5 or 6 days late, that's not going to work this time. I'm definitely not going to go back and change grades after they're submitted. So turn this stuff in. Unless, well, no, we're not going to go with unless. If there's some unusual circumstance, but if you've been behind all 4 weeks and then you have some emergency this week, ooh, that's a problem. So turn your stuff in, okay? All right, chapter 15 stuff, we'll talk about land redistribution. To me, always when you talk about Reconstruction, that's the big failure, is money. Yeah, you can be free, that's cool, but if you're broke, you're not that free. You guys know that, especially if you're still, like 15 or 16, you're feeling independent, you might have gotten your driver's license, but you don't have any money. So, so you're only as independent as your parents let you be. Yeah. And as an adult, if you don't have any money, it's problematic. I mean, it just really is, because most of us don't have parents that'll let us. My dad would probably let me live with him right now, but no. All right. But yeah, most of us without money are in a spot. And especially if, you always say that you got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Well, if you don't have any boots and your family didn't have any boots, there are no straps. It's tricky. It just is. So, and usually the people who you got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, their parents at least help provide them some boots, or they had something to work with, is what I'm saying. That doesn't mean no. I mean, I get it. People rags to riches. It happens. It does, and it's amazing. It's not the norm. Most of us, like, I don't know, my folks were poor, really pretty poor, but they worked really hard to make sure that I was good at school, taught me to read, that kind of stuff. So those were my boots. I used those straps, that sort of thing. But you're a slave. No one in your family's ever been paid. It's your parents, grandparents, great grandparents. No one's ever earned any money. So no one has any assets at all, and you can't go to school. So it's tricky. I'm not saying there weren't some amazing folks who managed to be successful anyway, in spite of the odds, but it's just hard without resources. Important successes and failures of the Freedmen's Bureau, laws regarding Reconstruction, Civil War amendments. You notice how I keep talking about those? They're important. Successes and failures of Reconstruction, your big question for this chapter, if you choose it. Reasons for and results of Johnson impeachment. Boy, that's a complicated and weird thing. Or it's not. I don't know. We'll decide. The KKK starts during this time period, and the Enforcement Act, and Reconstruction, difficulties in the Grant administration, and then the end of Reconstruction. I would also suggest to you, and we'll probably go back and talk about, or we'll talk about it more tomorrow as well. If you do the Reconstruction question, the one thing that I've noticed when people do this is they usually stop at Johnson, and they don't talk about Grant or the end of Reconstruction. I think at the very least, you have to mention when and why Reconstruction ends, if you answer that question. That's what I think. All right. Hey, I didn't even ask, do you guys have any questions? That was so rude. Do you guys have any questions? Is there anything you want to ask before we get started? No. Maybe. To talk about history. You guys paying attention? I know some of you are. I know some of you aren't either. We should talk badly about people that we know. I'm kidding. We're not talking badly about anyone. Except people in history. We'll talk badly about them today. All right. I feel like I didn't have the Reconstruction Plan notes in this chapter because I don't remember going over them. Chapter 14, I mean. I knew what I meant. Hey, there's those amendments again. Those amendments. Those are important. We've talked about that. So, yeah, 13th Amendment. And somebody reminded you yesterday, it's like free. What was your, I forgot. So freedom, citizenship, voting, something like that. Free citizens vote, maybe. Yeah. So 13th Amendment frees former slaves. 14th Amendment allows allows citizenship for everybody born in the United States, which means that they have constitutional rights, and then 10, 15 have the right to vote. So there you go. Free citizens vote. Very nice, thanks. All right, here we go. Chapter 15. Chapter 15. All right, so Reconstruction. Reconstruction starts with some promise, I think. Certainly with Lincoln in charge after the Civil War, things are going to go well. Except, Lincoln gets assassinated, and then things don't go so well after that. So, goodness. You wonder why in the world would Lincoln pick Johnson? Are you wondering that? Johnson's from Tennessee. Tennessee was part of the Confederacy, you probably heard. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. Johnson is the only Southern senator who continued to attend the Senate during, except, I know some of you don't just for votes, except the South isn't voting. they're not voting because, you know, the presidential election is before the Civil War ends. So, I mean, that I think is the standard answer for votes. Yeah, I think that's the standard answer why politicians do everything. Lincoln's a little different. I'm not saying he's not a politician. He does political things all the time because, you know, he has to. And if he doesn't win re-election, then he doesn't get to do more political things, right? But I think in this instance, a couple of reasons. One, he's trying to reward a Southerner, one, for showing his loyalty to the Union for opposing secession. He's the only one that did. Two, he's trying to emphasize that the country is going to be reunified. And three, he's assuming that the vice president wouldn't have any power, really, because the vice president generally only has the amount of power that the president allows them to have. And during that era, none. Yeah, it was really unusual for the vice president to do much of any consequence. You know, and in the modern era, typically, well, I don't know, the modern era, you know, the last two vice presidents, I'm not sure. Pence probably had some unusual jobs, would be my guess. But yeah, I think you pick, in the modern era, you do pick a vice president to get votes you wouldn't normally get. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. But, you know, the problem for Lincoln is even though we're trying to emphasize unity, we're trying to reward somebody for their loyalty to the Union, Lincoln gets assassinated, and yeah, then you got a mess. Then you have a mess. So Lincoln is gone, and we have to figure out Reconstruction. We have to figure stuff out. Lincoln does a nice job in the second inaugural, which I've linked and made you read and all sorts of stuff. I apparently think it's an important speech. I'm reminding everybody that it's really both the North and the South's fault for the Civil War, and maybe more the South than the North, because they wanted to perpetuate slavery. However, the North didn't do a thing to end it. They can just continued it. You know, it's like, well, we don't want to, we know it's wrong, but we don't want to stop it because we don't want to cause problems. So he does consider the war divine retribution. And I know it's not church or anything, but just reminding you that that sort of thought and talk and that sort of inaugural address, that sort of political speech with lots of biblical allusion, very typical in this era. Not as typical in the modern era. I think the only recent president, I know if Mike Pence had been president, you would have heard it a lot. But yeah, Mike president, that'd be interesting. Mike Pence is president. I don't think that would happen. But I also didn't think Donald Trump would happen. Who is the president like to quote the Bible and stuff? George Bush, the younger one, a little more than modern presidents tended to. Yeah. But if you went back to like 1950s and earlier, it would be pretty common. So, all right, back to business. Oh, yeah, I did say that I wanted to mention some Reconstruction plans. Sorry for scrolling down while I'm talking to you, but I'm doing it, aren't I? Yeah, for Reconstruction plans. I don't know why I didn't put them in the notes. What was I thinking? So the Reconstruction plans, you have the presidential or the Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, which he started talking about as it looked like things were going a little better for the North. So Lincoln's Reconstruction plan is often called the 10% plan. I should probably type this in here a little bit. So now you know that when I type this in here, it's not going to show up in your copy. So you should probably write it down, take a screenshot, whatever. I can make a title, couldn't I? So Reconstruction plans. So we have the 10% plan, which is Lincoln. And this would allow southern states could have their own elections once, that's some fine typing, 10% of their citizens pledge future loyalty to the Union. Now, this is pretty lax. And the Congress at the time period goes, that's not even harsh enough. The war's not even over. Look how forgiving you're trying to be. That's not cool. And they went, no, Congress is not having this at all. Because it doesn't punish the South in a way that the Congress wants the South punished. And remember too, the war is not over during this time period. You know, when Lincoln starts talking about this, it's really kind of end of 1863. So the Congress comes up with something called the Wade, that's not the WODA, it's the Wade-Davis bill. I'm the worst at typing. I still don't understand how anyone could be as bad as I am at typing. Play piano, I can write 82 million papers, but I can't type. So Wade-Davis plan. This would require, and this is a congressional response to Lincoln. And I think I have notes about the ones we actually end up with. So we'll start with these, and then we'll go back to this when we get through it in the notes. So this is the Congress's response to Lincoln. 50% of eligible voters there we go. Voters must pledge that they had never voluntarily supported the Confederacy. Now, Congress passes this, and Lincoln does the pocket veto. Do you know about the pocket veto? Let me spell Confederacy. Confederacy. So let me type that it passes Congress, and Lincoln responds. Lincoln responds with the pocket veto. Is that your phone ringing or mine? I know it's mine. I'm amazed. I promise you, no one calls me at all during the entire day except during class. It's amazing. Lincoln responds with the pocket veto. I know one of you is in the chat. Tell me what the pocket veto is. I'm excited to see this. Let me finish typing. Okay. All right, people talking about the pocket veto. Let's see it. Pocket veto is a weird thing. Okay. I am making additional comments. It's true. Yeah, I was adding the reconstruction plans because I didn't put them in the notes originally. And I'm just saying they might be on the quiz or something. You know, I don't, yeah, okay. Yeah, we're just a bit, it ties into some stuff in chapter 15. You know, all these chapters are related, right? You know that. I know you do. All right. Oh my goodness. Okay. I thought you guys were talking pocket veto. So let me talk pocket veto. All right, so Congress says, hey, Lincoln, that is not hard enough. You got to be more strict with the South because they started this war. They started a bunch of stuff. This is, of course, part of the reason you have the second inaugural. It's like, I know it's the South's fault, but it's our fault too. All right, so Congress says no. 50% of eligible voters have to say they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy. Well, crud, that's not possible in the South. So what Congress is saying is we don't want the South to vote for a little while until some new voters come up, you know, who were minors during that time period and couldn't technically voluntarily support the Confederacy. Maybe they'll think a different way. So we want to punish that generation by not letting them vote for a while. So this is this is the congressional response to Lincoln's 10% plan. And then Lincoln goes like, nah, we're not doing that. So this is in 1864. I didn't put the date in there. Historians love dates, and I should put them in there. So in 1864, this happens, and that's, of course, an election year. And it's also the year that the Civil War's it becomes very obvious by the second half of 64. 63 is when the North starts consistently winning battles. And then in 64, it's all downhill for the South. So you know the North's going to win. So Lincoln's running for re-election, Congress is running for re-election. That's part of the reason they want to appear super harsh, that kind of thing. And Lincoln says, no, let's not do that. Pocket veto. Here's how, did you ever watch the little show where the bill becomes a law and he sings a song? What is that called? I can't remember what it's called. But it was really trendy when we were kids. I can't think of it, but the bill becomes a law. Like Congress proposes a bill, and then they House and Senate have to agree on it, and then they conference committee, all that kind of stuff. So eventually they pass it, and then the president has to decide: do I sign it into law or do I veto it? So sign it into law, it becomes a law, and then veto Schoolhouse Rock. That's what it's called, right? Is that what one of you just typed in? Congress passes it, the president signs it, it becomes a law, or the president can veto it and it doesn't become a law, but then Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 vote, which hardly ever happens because it's hard to do. But the president can also choose to not sign it and not veto it, which is an interesting choice. I don't know that that happens a lot. It doesn't happen a lot. Yes, only a bill. Yes, that's it. Schoolhouse Rock. So if the president says, you know what, I'm not signing that thing, there are two things that can happen. One, if it happens during most of the legislative session, if the president doesn't sign it, it becomes a law without his consent. So when the president doesn't sign one of those things, it means a couple of things. One, he doesn't agree with it. So he doesn't want to sign on to it, saying that he agrees with it. And two, he's pretty sure that if he did sign it, the Congress would override his veto. And he doesn't want to have his veto overridden because that looks bad for his authority, that kind of stuff. So that's when a president's acknowledging that it might be a popular idea. He disagrees with it. He's not going to sign on to it, but he knows it's going to become law without him. So, and that's a pretty unusual situation. I can't think of any time in the modern era that we've seen that. There probably is a time, and it's probably on a smaller law or something, but I can't remember any time that that's happened. Now, at the end of a legislative session, it's different. Like the last, I think it's 10 days of a legislative session. If the president chooses not to sign a bill, then it doesn't become law. Any other part of the legislative session, it does. But at the end of the legislative session, it doesn't. And that's called a pocket veto. So that's not like, bam, in your face, I'm putting the stamp on it veto. That's like a pocket. It's a kind of behind the scenes quietly. Yeah, I don't want to throw it in your face, but this isn't becoming a law. So it's your little subtle kind of, no, I disagree with you. The reason that they made that provision in the Constitution apparently is that at the end of a legislative session, people try to do crazy stuff. I think we see it here in Texas. I don't know if you watch the Texas legislature, you may have noticed a whole bunch of people walking out before the final votes in the last session, and you'll see a special session in a week or two that'll be equally as exciting. But rowdy stuff happens toward the end of sessions, and it's not when people are at their rational best. So this acknowledges that that can happen, and this gives the president an out if something that he thinks is a little out of control happens. And Lincoln thought that the Wade Davis or 50% plan was too much. So the thought was, in Lincoln's mind, we'll all take the break between the legislative sessions. We'll come back in whenever they came back, which was April. In those days, they've shortened that period dramatically since that time. But we'll all come back in April. We'll have had a holiday. The war will probably be over by then. Everybody will have some rest. Clearer heads will prevail when we come back. And of course, in the interim, in the break, that's when Lincoln gets assassinated. So there you go. All right, so back to the official notes, so maybe you'll be less confused. Yeah. I think it was important to add that stuff, though. You guys have to trust me a little. You don't trust me. The class is almost over. You don't trust me. That's fine. All right, so Civil War ends. Lincoln wins re-election, second inaugural. It's everybody's fault. Lincoln gets assassinated. All right. Cool stuff that happens during this time period. College education for former slaves, perhaps. This is where you start to see the development of traditionally Black colleges. Now, Hampton was there before. Hampton Institute was there before this era, but Booker T. Washington, who's a graduate of Hampton in Virginia, will start Tuskegee, and you'll see a host of Black colleges, primarily in the South, because that's where most African Americans live. Yeah. And this is also a reflection of the reality during this time period that if you were Black, or we'll just go with not a white guy, you're not getting to go to a state college. There are very few state colleges that will allow African Americans or women to attend. I don't know if there's any during this era. If they are, they're definitely in the North. Oberlin College does in Ohio, but I think it's a little later, and it's not a state university. There'll be a few. Who's the first graduate of Harvard? It's W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah, the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. So even what you would think of as fairly enlightened older colleges, yeah, they're not okay with that. So this is an era where some of that's going to start to change. Not much, which is why you have the historically Black universities. I know I used to have students, because you don't know stuff until you know it. And then I think sometimes you just repeat stuff you hear your older relatives say. It isn't always a good call. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But I can remember having, younger students ask me more privately, sometimes angrily during class, why in the world, if people want to be equal, do they have their own separate colleges? Why is there a women's college? Why is there a Black college? It's like, first of all, if you want to go to Texas Women's University, you can go. They'll let you in, I promise. And if you wanted to go to Hampton or Howard or Tuskegee or Southern or wherever you want to go, they'll let you in. Yeah, there's no all white, all Black, all women, all men. There's nothing like that. But it's because in the older days, of course, even state universities excluded people, even though they took their tax dollars to pay for the university. So it was a response to those two universities not allowing certain groups. So the groups created their own universities. In the modern era, of course, sort of, we can all go anywhere. I know you have to get in and there are certain restrictions, but you know what I'm saying. All right. Frederick Douglass says that free men aren't free until they can vote. And certainly it's time for African Americans to get the right to vote and to become more involved and active in their governments. And Douglass is going to say Civil War is the beginning, not the end goal. And that, of course, makes sense to pretty much everyone in the modern era. I think it probably didn't make as much sense to everyone in that time period. They thought, well, slavery's ended. Nobody has anything to complain about anymore. All right, most important government agency practically during that time period for former slaves is the Freedmen's Bureau. You want to have a vague familiarity with the Freedmen's Bureau. It's a government agency that was supposed to help African Americans get basic health care. And I'm not even talking Affordable Care Act. Nobody went to the doctor back in these days. So probably, clean up, wound care, that kind of stuff after the Civil War, but also basic sanitation. That's the emphasis on health in healthcare during this time period. Cleanliness, sterilizing things, just basic training, how to boil the water, not how to boil the water. I know people knew how to boil the water, but why to boil water in certain instances, just basic, health, not necessarily medical care, but health information. Redistribution of plantation assets, as we know, that really doesn't happen. Practical education, reading and writing, basic literacy, because now you got to get a job, so you're going to have to negotiate with your employer. And the South is going to require employment contracts for Blacks. So you got to be able to read the contract, not that you're going to get a court to enforce it, but you still need to be able to read it. On reuniting slave families from the South. Most successful at teaching basic literacy and reuniting families. So basic literacy, they wanted African Americans to be able to read as well as whites during this time period. And they probably achieved that to a pretty good level. I know some of you are going, but you said no school. I did say that. But here's another thing. Most poor white folks didn't go to school either, especially in the South. It was kind of true in the North as well, but it was especially true in the South. So, yeah. To have public school, you have to have a tax base, which probably means you have to have a middle class. You also have to have a desire to have public school, which rich people in the South really not that keen on letting people who were poor go to school. Their thoughts seemed to be that they didn't necessarily want greater economic success along the spectrum, the socioeconomic spectrum, because the assumption was if you make more, then I make less. Like there's a limit to how much money there is. So, if I make $50 more, then you make $50 less, that sort of thing. Like there's a finite amount of financial resources. All right. So yeah, getting African Americans to that level is not as hard as you might imagine. And I'm not saying that it's done completely well. I am saying that there's a concerted effort by the government. Now, the government in this instance is the federal government. And the states in the South are not going to be terribly impressed with the federal government sending teachers to the South to help educate former slaves. They're not going to like that. Yeah, they're really not going to like Northerners coming to the South and meddling in their business. Yeah. All right. So we know that Andrew Jackson, as vice president, becomes president after Lincoln's assassination, and that creates a problem or two. Yeah. So Johnson on equality, I know we've mentioned this before. His problem with slavery and slave owners, because he wasn't one. That was his problem. He wasn't one. Yeah. He thought that the upper class, that the plantation owning class, was really didn't operate in the best interest of everyone in the South. And he believed that they were cotton snobs, essentially. And of course, his father died young, so he and his older brother were raised by his mom, who couldn't afford to keep them, so had to send them out as apprentices, which is what poor people did with their kids, so that they could learn a trade. And being an apprentice was, meant somebody else's family was teaching you a job. He learned to be a tailor, as somebody who made clothes, hated the job, ran away from the person. As an apprentice, you're supposed to stay, I think, till you're 18. He ran away early, started his own tailor shop, ends up marrying the daughter of the wealthiest man in town, and who wasn't very excited that she was marrying a poor guy, but for whatever reason, it's true love. And he's a very ambitious fellow. So, he'll be a hardworking guy. He'll end up going to college eventually and, becoming a local politician, state politician, senator, and then of course, vice president. So in a lot of ways, he's kind of a rags to riches story, but then that's not usually how we look at Andrew Johnson. We kind of look at him as the guy who messed up Reconstruction, and that's fair. It is. Yeah. So he thought every family should own a slave, and that if his mom had owned a slave, then he could have sold the slave or rented the slave out, and she wouldn't have had to work so hard. So he's not an equal rights kind of guy at all. Yeah. So his biggest problem with slavery is not everybody had a slave, that they weren't spread out more evenly. He he continued to serve in the Senate for Tennessee during the Civil War. And of course, Lincoln's assumption was he'd be ceremonial. And that, of course, wasn't the case after Lincoln died. When Johnson becomes president, his Reconstruction plan really is just pardon all the former Confederates and let them run for Congress again. He really has no Reconstruction plan except for pardoning people. So he just says, you know what, submit your application for pardon. And people did. They came up and talked to him and told him how great he was. And he pardoned them before the legislative session. He said, okay, South, conduct your own elections. They elected really essentially the same people. Excuse me. They essentially elected the same people who were there before the Civil War. And so those guys come to Congress, and Congress just looks and says, no, this is not happening. We are not going to allow these people to be back in Congress. We're rewarding them for starting the Civil War. There's no punishment for them at all. So Congress says, look, this is not your decision, Andrew Johnson. We're going to pass our own bill, and we're going to set up Reconstruction the way that we want it to be. Now, this idea of Reconstruction was the idea that the South would get to have elections, they would be part of the country again, and they would have their own representatives. And Lincoln, wanted, we already talked about what Lincoln wanted. Sorry that I'm scrolling again. What Lincoln wanted and what Congress wanted, and it was different. That is interesting that I didn't put, I'm sorry. Scrolling down again. Yeah. I don't know why I didn't put more about the Reconstruction plans in here, but maybe I'll type a little bit more in a bit. All right, so Congress rejects Johnson's desire to seat everybody. So Congress says radical or military Reconstruction. And this sets up 5 military districts in the South. And all this is in the book. I don't feel terrible about it. It's not like it's a secret. It's in the book, I promise. I promise it's there. So it's 5 military districts to be governed. That's not a good way to spell governed, by federally appointed governors, most of whom are Civil War generals. They're from the military. And it's essentially martial law until each individual state ratifies the 14th and 15th Amendments. I really am bad at typing. Okay. So until each individual state ratifies the 14th and 15th Amendments. I don't know, do we need to go over the amendments again? Probably not. If you're wondering, like, why didn't they want them to ratify the 13th Amendment? That was already done. So, that happened before the war was over. So they're stuck with that one. They don't have to. Once the southern states ratify those amendments, they can have their own elections and operate as individual states again. So. And if you're wondering, does that ever happen? I'm going to go, no, it doesn't. I'm saying that because it doesn't. So once they're ratified, each state can have elections and operate once again as an individual state. With what's the word I want to say? Constitutional autonomy. With the powers that the Constitution grants it. Doesn't mean it can do its own thing. It means it can do whatever the Constitution says it can do, which is quite a bit, federalism, that sort of thing. All right, the southern states are going, nope, you can't make us do that. None of this is fair. We don't like the 14th, 15th Amendment. We don't want to grant equality to former slaves. We don't want former slaves to vote. We're not doing it. So you end up with this throughout the whole period. I think it was 1867. I don't remember. Let me see. We'll check it later. All right. What ends up happening is impeachment. Because Congress and Johnson are mad at each other. And Johnson tried to seat all the Southerners. He pardoned a bunch of Confederates against the will of really the Congress. So the Congress says, you know what, we got to get rid of this Andrew Johnson guy, and then we'll deal with someone that will listen to us and will manage the situation better. So their desire is get rid of Andrew Johnson. So the problem is Andrew Johnson is super annoying. He vetoes a lot of bills. He'll come in and cuss them out from time to time. However, he does not break the law. And to impeach somebody, you really need them to break the law, not just be a jerk. So what Congress did is they passed a law they knew he would break. Now, the law was likely unconstitutional, but you got to do what you got to do, right? So they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. So I would, have some vague familiarity with the Tenure of Office Act. So the Tenure of Office Act said that if the president wants to fire someone who is appointed by the Senate, then they have to get Senate approval. Now, people who are appointed by the Senate that the president could actually fire would be his own advisors, cabinet level advisors. So, secretary in the modern era, secretary of defense, secretary of, whatever, there's the secretary of. During that era would have been secretary of war, secretary of state, secretary of the treasury. They're his advisors, essentially. But the Senate said, you know what, if you want to fire these guys, you have to get our approval first. There's no provision for that in the Constitution. There's no reason to think that that was a good idea. But what they did know, here's what they knew. Andrew Johnson was about to fire Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, because he was the last remaining Lincoln cabinet advisor. So Johnson wanted to get rid of Lincoln's advisors and get his own, and that's going to be his argument. And I think in the modern era, nobody would disagree with that. Plus, we know that it's unconstitutional. But Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson vetoes it. They override the veto, and they say, okay, we'll wait and see if he fires Edwin Stanton. He does, and then they begin articles of impeachment. Now, to impeach a president, I know you've seen it. I know we've seen it in the modern era 3 times, 2 for Trump, 1 for Clinton. I know some of you are going, yeah, Nixon as well. They started it, but didn't finish it with Nixon. So the way that impeachment works is you can be impeached without being convicted. We've never had anyone convicted. So they're like 0 for 4, I guess it is. Judges, they've impeached judges before. But impeachment starts in the House of Representatives, where they have to have a vote whether or not to bring the articles of impeachment. And then the Senate has a trial if the House votes to bring the articles of impeachment. So typically, the House is elected differently. They have the 2-year terms. They tend to be a little more, we'll go with radical and more willing to do these seemingly outrageous things, I suppose, like impeachment, because they get elected every 2 years. So they got to make a name for themselves. They tend to do more dramatic things. So the House decides we're going to have the articles of impeachment. It's sort of like an indictment in a criminal proceeding. So you have to have an indictment and then you have the trial. So the House does the indictment part, the Senate does the trial part. And the Senate tends to be more conservative. And I don't mean more Republican or anything like that. I mean, they're more likely to take, or less likely to take dramatic action because they have the longer terms, they tend to have more power, and they tend to want to preserve their own power. And they're also supposed to bring a little more stability to the legislative process and also to, other parts of the governing process, including this. So when they devised the idea of impeachment, they made it hard so that we didn't just do it a lot of times for political reasons, just because somebody was annoying. Johnson was annoying. And they set him up. I mean, they passed a law that they knew he was going to violate, and they made it illegal for him to fire an advisor. It's not like, it's probably not a crime. You know what I'm saying? But the House says, heck yeah, we're in, let's go. And then the Senate says, maybe. So in the deliberation with the Senate, the problem for Johnson is, they have to have a 2/3 vote to impeach a dude, to impeach the president. And there are more than 2/3 Republicans in the Senate because the South's not voting, so there's not very many Democrats there. So if they just go along party lines, Johnson's going to be impeached and convicted. He's going to be kicked out of office. So Johnson's lawyers talked to the impeachment committee, the impeachment managers, and they say, look, last year of his term, he's not running for re-election. He's not going to do anything else radical. Maybe you could not impeach him. Maybe you could vote against, maybe you could vote against impeachment. So, and against conviction. I know I keep saying that wrong. So I think it's 6 Republicans decide to vote against impeachment and then against conviction in the impeachment trial. So Johnson misses conviction by 1 vote. So, and he finishes out his term with some arguments, doesn't run for re-election, then goes home to Tennessee and runs for Senate again. It's really weird. And then he comes back, and when he comes back, everybody applauds him, standing ovation. It's like, way to go, president, running, serving in the Congress again, serving in the Senate. They ask him to give a speech, and he cusses them out for impeaching him. Yeah. What did I just do? Do you see the note still? All right, goodness. So impeachment has the 2 parts. You've got the indictment part that the House does and the trial part that the Senate does. We've never had a president convicted in this Senate. We never have. But we've had three, Johnson, Clinton. They started with Nixon, but Nixon resigns before they do the trial. And then Trump twice. So there you go. So I've gotten to see, all but the Johnson one. I'm not that old. All right, so Johnson goes away, and then he's Andrew Johnson. Ulysses S. Grant will replace him. All right, some more details about the Reconstruction period. Yeah, here we go. Andrew Johnson orders federal government to return any confiscated land. So all of the stuff that happened during Sherman's land order, any land that had ever been given from a plantation owner to a former slave was now given back. And then what ends up happening, and the book talks about this extensively, people make their money in the South primarily through the crop lien and sharecropping system. Now, landowners in the South, plantation owners, that it's not technically plantation anymore, but now they just own a bunch of land. But most people don't own any land in the South. You've got the yeoman farmer type dudes, and then you've got really, really poor dudes, mostly a lot of former slaves, but there's also some really poor white dudes that don't have any land either. So these guys become part of the sharecropping system. And what they do is they work somebody else's farm, and then when the crop comes in, they split the proceeds of the crop. So it means you're not getting paid for however long it takes to grow a crop and harvest it. So 9 months typically. So if you're in that category, you don't have any money. You probably also don't have any tools. And if you're in the former slave category, you don't have a place to live. So what happens is the former slave owners go like, hey, former slaves, yes, you guys need a job now, don't you? You want to work for me? If you do, I'll only charge you X amount of rent for your slave quarters. And I'll only charge you X amount of rent to use those tools that you use all the time that are technically mine. And you can work my land and harvest my crops like you've always done. And I'll pay you when the crop comes in. And you can have 30% of the proceeds of the crop and you can split it among yourselves. And then I'll take 70 or 40, 60, whatever. But I'll take rent out of your check. I'll take tool rent out of your check. If you need clothes and stuff for your kids, I'll get those for you, but we'll charge that against your future earnings, and I'll charge you some interest. So when the crop comes in, you can pay me back. And when the crop comes in, every bit of money that they earned probably went back to the landowner in a sharecropping system. So you really can never get ahead. So you're not going to earn enough money to buy your own land and have your own farm someday. So you're not going to have the resources you need to be independent of the landowner in the sharecropping system. And what happens if the crop doesn't come in? Because sometimes, there's a flood or there's a drought or there's a whole bunch of locusts or some grasshoppers, or maybe there's a fire, the lightning strikes or something, and the crop is destroyed, and you've worked a whole year and there's no income. So then you've got another year's worth of debt that adds up against you. You're never getting out of the sharecropping system. You're always going to be poor, and you're always going to be farming someone else's land, and you're always going to be in debt. And they're going to pass laws in the South that if you're Black and in debt, you can't get a job with anyone else. You have to keep working for the landowner until you pay off the debt. It won't be quite the same for white guys. But I mean, the truth is anybody in the sharecropping system is going to have a hard time making a living. The crop lien system's a little different, maybe a little better. It's a small landowner, and he owns his land, but he doesn't have enough money to buy the seed or the equipment that he needs to put in the crop. So he's going to borrow against the value of his land to get the seed and the equipment that he needs. Now that probably works out okay unless the crop doesn't come in. And then the lien is the loan, the guarantee of the loan is his land. So if he can't pay back the loan, then the bank will take his land, probably sell it to that large landowner, and then he becomes a sharecropper. So people in the crop lien system usually were one crop failure away from becoming a sharecropper. So they're kind of, in the modern era, maybe the paycheck to paycheck guys, working poor kind of folks, and sharecroppers are a whole different level of poor. They just are. But all right, hopefully that was a reasonable explanation. The book goes into a lot of depth about it. So farm worker charged to rent tools, perhaps a place to live, charged interest. A system ensured that non-land owners were unable to achieve economic stability. And of course, with Johnson's executive order taking land away from former slaves, this really means that if you're Black and in the South and a former slave, which is probably about the only way you're Black and in the South at this point, because most Southern states had made it illegal for free Blacks to live near plantations, your economic success is going to be challenging. It's also why a lot of the historically Black colleges even though they charged tuition, almost everybody there was kind of work study. And most of those universities or colleges also had farmland. And so their workers worked the farmland and, built the buildings and worked in the kitchens. And Booker T. Washington worked in the kitchen and served as a custodian. Almost everybody who went to those colleges worked at the college while they went there, to help pay for the college and their own tuition. And they had a lot of northern donors. That was pretty common. There weren't a lot of southern donors, but it was these radical Republicans in the north who would donate money to these colleges in the south, which is kind of noble in some ways. And then, there's also I notice you're donating to colleges in the south, but you're not building any in the north. So there's that as well. So, there's a lot of stuff going on during this time period. Women's rights groups, not so excited about the 15th Amendment. I know I have a quiz question about this. Excuse me. The women's rights movement really was in conjunction with the abolition movement in a lot of ways. Excuse me, because as you noticed in earlier chapters, women and slaves felt like they had fairly similar legal rights, which, there's probably some accuracy to. I know that in many instances, especially upper middle class and wealthier white women, their lives, they could potentially be hard, but they typically weren't as bad as, certainly not as bad as slaves, and their children weren't enslaved. And there was a possibility of things getting better in ways that there weren't. I'm not equating being a woman with a slave, but they were equating it legally. And there's some validity to that discussion. So it's part of the reason that you saw a really large number of women working in the abolition movement. So once abolition was achieved, there's a push for women to get the right to vote. And then the 15th Amendment happens. And there'll be some legal challenges. Does this include women? There'll be some women that go to vote, they get arrested. The Supreme Court will decide that it does not include women, that it only includes men. And then some of the women's rights groups will be upset about this and say that that needs to be challenged further, that it's unfair, and they'll make some comments that they're racist. We'll just go with that. They'll say things essentially like, why would you let a bunch of ignorant Black men vote when educated white women can't? And they would make better voters and citizens. Like, oh, okay then. So the women's rights movement splits over this. And then you end up with the National Women's Suffrage Association opposing the 15th Amendment unless it included women, and the American Women's Suffrage Association saying, no, that's fine, and we'll push for a separate amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment passes in 69 or 70. And then after all the challenges, the women's rights groups stay separated until 1890. So the people who opposed the 15th Amendment thought that it should include women and were willing to not have African-American men voting if women couldn't. So, and the other side of the group went, no, let's get what we can get now and we'll get our part later. So, but it does lead to some pretty ugly rhetoric during the time period. Successes that you see, Black congressmen elected during this era, Hiram Revels, Blanche Bruce, 14 other African Americans. I believe these guys were the senators, and then there are 14 other congressmen. If you look at pictures of Southern legislators during this time period, legislatures, because of the military districts, African American men were able to vote in the South during Reconstruction. Their votes were protected by, or their voting was protected by soldiers. So on election days, it was easy for Black men to vote, relatively easy. So they did, and you will notice that many, about 600, African American men will serve in their state legislatures as well. And if you go to the Texas Congress and walk around, you'll notice photos from that era that have African American men as legislators, and you'll notice that in every southern state. This is going to lead to the rise of the KKK because white people in the South are not very excited that they're being governed by Black men who were slaves just a few years before. So it's going to lead to some difficult things. Now, these guys will represent their constituents, promote and ensure new degrees of fairness for former slaves. It doesn't approach true equality, but it's kind of a beginning, and you see a bit of progress. It will lead to some argument that African American men clearly are equally capable of education, governing, that sort of thing. And you had certainly seen in the brief period where the land was redistributed to former slaves capable of running farms, businesses, that sort of thing. So you see a little bit of progress during this era, but you also see some other stuff. Here comes some other stuff. Okay. Some of this stuff is just kind of definition stuff for us. And then I know that I've mentioned this before, but tomorrow will be kind of a review day. I really think you should come. I'm not saying don't come, but we'll go over the stuff that I think it'll help you with the quiz. And then we'll talk about things you may want to put in your questions. So I would, yeah. So we'll finish the content here in a few minutes from this chapter, but then tomorrow we'll kind of go over stuff, not kind of, we'll go over stuff that'll help you with the quiz and maybe talk about a little more in depth about what to put in the questions, although, you know, we've talked about it a little. Okay, so some definition stuff, because it says to know these things for the quiz, and these things are on the quiz for sure. People who helped out during Reconstruction. Here were groups of people who helped out. The nickname for the folks who came from the North and then to the South to help during Reconstruction, or maybe to get government contracts, they're called carpetbaggers. And this is a negative name for foreigners who move, it could be foreigners, but Northerners who move to the South. I think, and no offense at all, because I know some of you are in this group, but I think that the like a modern thing would be Californians moving to Texas. I know you probably hear complaints about Californians all the time, especially if you are one. It's like, why did you come here? Don't California my Texas, that sort of thing. Don't bring your liberal ideas here. Don't ruin my government, that sort of thing. This was the sentiment that Southerners had about Northerners moving to the South to help out during Reconstruction. It's like, we don't want your help. We were fine without you. We didn't even want to be a part of you anymore, so don't even come. They call them carpetbaggers because their suitcases were made out of carpet during that time period. So if you had a carpet bag, it was definitely a sign that you were not from here. You were traveling. Yeah. So yeah, like my little nephew, he's a carpetbagger right now, although he had a backpack. He didn't have one. Yeah. Okay. All right. Did somebody make a California comment? Let's look. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Is this the Jim Crow era or the era of Reconstruction? Can we go with both? Are you okay with that? Yeah, because Jim Crow, the idea of Jim Crow is where you start to have these separate rules for Blacks and whites, and you don't really need those when African Americans are enslaved. So you start to see this. The Southern states will respond to Reconstruction, the things forced upon them by the federal government by making local laws that require different things of Blacks and whites. So those will be what we call Jim Crow laws. So the Jim Crow laws restrictions kind of start during this time period and then really hit quite a bit harder after Reconstruction formally ends. I don't know if that's a helpful answer. but that's the one I have for you. And yeah, Texans, they're a little hard on the foreigners. Now, and by foreigners, they mean anyone not born in Texas. So, and I will confess to being one of those, as we've already acknowledged. I'm not from here, but yeah, I moved here. Oh, it's a long time ago, 30 something years. But yeah, I was older. College. I came during college. I was 20. All right, halfway through college. All right. So scalawags, carpetbaggers are folks from the north who helped out. The scalawags are folks from the south who helped with northern reform. These guys are probably businessmen who just kind of recognize that this is the way things are going. They want to make money. They want to rebuild the South economically, and they're going to be looked down on. Scalawags, I think, one of my friends tell me that was in SpongeBob SquarePants, which apparently is quite a fine historical program. The people that you don't like are called scalawags in there. And this definitely was not a term of endearment. So traditional Southern whites, former plantation owners, not a huge fan of these guys, because the thought is if we don't cooperate, then there you go. Somebody else a carpetbagger. If you don't cooperate, then things will go back to the way they were before, which is what redeemers are trying to do. So redeemers are kind of the favored sons of the South, Southern pro-business Democrats who want to get control of the government from these people who are messing things up, and they want to restore Southern tradition. And usually they're kind of the business side of the political side, which is the White Citizens Council, or that's the political side of the KKK, to regain political and economic control for Southerners, and to send people to the federal government to begin to push back against Reconstruction. Yeah. All right. Oh, people. Yeah, a lot of people are moving here. So almost everybody who's in Austin in the last 30 or 40 years isn't from Austin or from the Austin area. And people are moving to Texas. So yeah. But I mean, people were moving to the South during this era, not in as large numbers, but it's where the government contracts were going as well. So if there's money, and business, then people tend to follow the money and the business. So normal stuff. I know I've mentioned it 8,000 times. I live in Leander, and the big problem here right now that you hear people complain about is that they're building all these apartments. We don't need any more apartments in Leander. It's like, well, apparently someone thinks we do. So, they're building them, people move to them, our population's growing. I'm sure there are reasons. Part of it is that Austin isn't as affordable. Part of it is, it's still a little bit the edge of the country out here. But it's funny to me, to hear people like, wow, I moved out here so I could live affordably, and now all these people are moving out here and it's not affordable. It's like, well, you did the same thing. You were just 5 years earlier. So, you want what you want, you just don't want it for someone else. That's not necessarily what's going on here. There are some people like, just really committed radical Republicans that wanted to see equality in the South. There were also some people that, were doing things for a cause. They saw like, oh, I can make things better. There were businessmen who came from the North to the South because like, man, I'm going to make a bunch of money this way. And the scalawag type people, those dudes like, we're broke, our economy's decimated. I'm going to make some money, might pull some other people up, or maybe they just want to make money for themselves, which, we love capitalism in the United States. So what the heck, why not? And then the redeemers are like, no, this is wrong. We need to get white people back in charge, and we need to be back the way we were. And these guys will eventually be the ones who get control again. It just takes a little while, but not too long. The enforcement acts are kind of a recognition of the creation of the KKK. So KKK, I assume that you're familiar with them, not for any other reason than they're the KKK. I'm not saying stuff about you, but Ku Klux Klan, apparently some sort of derivative of some Greek word for circle, Ku Klux, apparently. And the thought here of the origin of the group is to honor dead Southern soldiers, but also repress the push to give African Americans, former slaves, rights in the South. And a lot of the direct action in the early part of the KK was to prevent Black voters from voting. So scaring them, that sort of thing, burning down things, burning crosses, to intimidate, and then, at certain points cause physical harm. And certainly in the modern era, that's pretty much what we think of with the KKK is groups of people that will easily harm or kill people that they disagree with, that they think shouldn't have rights. And KKK in the modern era is pretty small percentage of way small percentage of the population, but and I don't know what we need to say about the KKK in the modern era. Probably not much. They're smallish. I know that there's concern about white supremacy groups, that kind of thing. The KKK for quite a while was a corporation. And in the 80s, when I was going to college, a woman sued the KKK through the Southern Poverty Law Center because her son had been killed by the KKK, by some people who had attended a KKK meeting, who were really encouraged to go out and kill a Black person. And her son, who was actually their high school friend, was who they killed. And so she sued the KKK and got all of their assets. So they had to declare bankruptcy. So that's part of the reason that the KKK is different in the modern era. They don't have money. Now, I know they operate on the internet and probably other dark web. I don't know the stuff I need to know about that kind of thing. But I also know that they're smaller and not nearly as influential because they don't have resources. If you take away resources, it's hard to have influence in the modern era. Was true back then as well. All right. But the KKK was suppressing Black voters. So Congress passes the Enforcement Acts or the Force Acts, or sometimes called the KKK Act, where these Southern governors, the five the district governors, could ask for the troops, the federal army, to come to protect voters during the elections. And so at the beginning of the Grant administration first term, when they asked for that, Grant sent the troops. In the modern era, the KKK, I don't know, we need to talk a whole lot about KKK history. In this era, it really was suppress Black voters in the South. And then we have this massive wave of immigration that happens 1830 to right before World War I. And then you see kind of round two of the KKK in a huge way in the 1920s. That's when they did the March on Washington, and they nearly got their candidate elected as the Democratic nominee for president one year. I think it was 24, maybe in 20. And and Al Smith, no, it wasn't Al Smith, but there was another who was a KKK lawyer who ends up being big in the Democratic Party. But that is really kind of the anti-immigration period for the KKK, where they really dislike, especially Catholic immigrants, because we'd had a massive influx of immigrants from Italy. And they didn't think that the new immigrants assimilated well. So, and they were also very in favor of prohibition, and they thought the new immigrants drank too much, that sort of thing. So that's when you see the KKK expand beyond just Black and white issues into this anti-immigrant sort of thing, which is anti-Catholic, anti-Jew. And then you see them again in a very strong way in the 1950s and 60s in opposition to the modern civil rights movement. Yeah. absolutely against, yeah, definitely against homosexuals as well. And I think you see that more in the third round of the KKK, if we can think of it that way, which is also why bankrupting the KKK mattered so much when it happened. But I say that the anti-homosexual bias, or in the modern, in the 50s and 60s version of the KKK, because to be honest, people weren't very open about being gay, transgender, homosexual, anything other than traditional straight kind of things. People weren't very open about that until you started to see it a little bit with Stonewall in the 60s, but really more, a little more in the 70s, and honestly more in the 80s. Yeah, to where people are much more comfortable about being open about who they are in their personal lives, that sort of thing. So the KKK doesn't deal with so much of that before, because to be honest, there's a general prejudice against that, um, a very strong general. I'm not saying there isn't still a general prejudice. I'm aware, but there's a very strong, vocal, legally supported general prejudice against um, any sorts of personal differences before that third iteration of the KKK. Yeah, it's an ugly group. And by saying that it's not as influential, I'm not saying it's not still terrible. It's clearly still terrible. It just doesn't have the power or influence that it did in the other eras of our country when it was bigger or more powerful. During this era, it's a huge problem. So in the first Grant administration, if the Southern governors asked for help, they got it. In the second administration, not so much. And we'll talk here in a few minutes about why that changes over time. All right, so enforcement acts, a sign that the Congress is still on board with Reconstruction, wants to make sure Black guys are voting in the South. And I know we've mentioned this before, but if you're wondering, why is the North so big on making sure that Black guys can vote in the South? One, we got the Johnson versus Congress thing. So there's really two poles. You're either with Johnson or against him. There's not a very moderate thing. Two, this is a nice way for the North to punish the South, because they know that Southern Black voters, men, former slaves who are voting in the South, are going to vote for Republicans. So this helps the Republicans in the North, who are slightly in the majority. And certainly Southern Democrats are way different than Northern Democrats during this era and during later eras as well. Yeah, in some ways. So it helps the North politically if African Americans get to vote. And then we'll go with the other thing we've talked about. Folks in the North don't want former slaves moving to the North. So, and they know that they don't have resources. Notice that there's not a lot of people providing resources for Blacks, former slaves, to relocate. There are a few communities that do that, and those are kind of, maybe it restores your faith in humanity to read about those groups. There's a group of people called exodusters, who are people who exodus the Deep South and moved to Western Kansas to be farmers. And there are groups, primarily religious groups, that will fund their trip and give them land in Western Kansas and give them resources to plant crops, that sort of stuff. So you'll see this unusually successful community of Black farmers in Western Kansas. And you'll also, I mean, if you read through stuff from this time period, you'll also notice communities in Iowa. Iowa is a more progressive place than you would expect it to be, because I think you just assume it's in the middle of the country and it's like a super white place. And you're not wrong about that. That's kind of a Norwegian Swede sort of area of the country. But those folks tend to be pretty progressive in philosophy and theology and that sort of stuff. So, and they also tend to have a little money, farmer money. I don't mean like, entrepreneur money. They're not like millionaires, but they tend to have a little extra and they're willing to share, that sort of thing. So you'll see a few communities that really welcome and encourage people of color to move to the North or the Midwest or something like that. But in general, folks in the North, they're, they're not really necessarily in favor of equality in the North. They just want Black guys voting in the South because it helps the North and punishes the South. I don't want to be that cynical, but there are reasons to be that cynical if you read more about it than you're reading if you just read the chapter. But still, please read the chapter. That'll help too. All right. So Grant administration is filled with some corruption in the second term. Grant also is dying. So he's distracted because his concern is really more, how's my family going to survive without me? Because he's got a wife and some of his kids are still young and didn't make a lot of money in the military because, you know, just like still, they don't pay that well. And presidents during that time period didn't really get their expenses paid. So they had a salary, but they tended to spend that and more being president and entertaining foreign dignitaries and that sort of thing. So there's really no money in what Grant had done for a living. So he's writing his memoir during the second term so that his family will have money after he dies. And he has some advisors that are pretty corrupt. There's 2 or 3 really big scandals that go on. There's his personal secretary is taking bribes to get access to the president. The head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs is taking bribes to get access to reservation contracts to be able to buy and sell things on Native American reservations. And then there's a group of congressmen who have made a fake holding company that bids on railroad contracts. Because remember, you know, they're still finishing lots of railroads that are federally funded during this time period. They're called Credit Mobilier. So they make a fake company and then they bid on railroad contracts and then they give themselves the contract and then they hire a subcontractor to do it for much less and pocket the profit. There are not very many things that are illegal during that time period, but that's one of them. So that gets people thrown in jail. And a couple of the people who helped organize that are in the Grant administration. So what's happening here, honestly, we're starting to see the second round of industrialization, the more mechanized version. The economy is expanding astronomically, exponentially. So there's so much more money in the economy, and people are, we'll say, distracted by that money and want some of it. So people are not as altruistic. I don't know that people were, that's probably not the right way to say it. People are starting to be more influenced by money and more concerned about these contracts where you can make money because there's so much more money to make. There's so much more money available. So the shift is moving away from how do we punish the South, which was kind of the concern of the North, to how do we get our hands on some of this new cash. And both the Democrats and Republicans will become increasingly interested in that, which is going to leave the Republicans, it's going to lead them away from enforcing Reconstruction. And this will allow the South to regain control, the control that the Redeemers wanted, so that they can recreate the modern South in the way that they want. Maybe modernize the economy a little, but at least revert back to a political structure that allows the wealthy white landowners and business owners, there's a few of those in the South, to really control the process in a way that they can continue to segregate African Americans, that they can strip them of their rights and eventually keep them from voting. And it doesn't take very long. And a lot of those politicians who were incredibly committed and serious about equality for African Americans are either deceased at this point or not involved in politics. And a lot of those guys tended to be a little older when the Civil War started, so they've aged out or they've passed on. All right. Here's how the South kept Southern Black, they kept African American men from voting. Literacy tests, and I think on the surface, this seems like a fine idea. We want to make sure people who are voting can read and write. But it wasn't a standardized test. So, if I liked you and I'm the voter registrar and I wanted you to vote, your literacy test would be to sign your name. If I didn't like you, it might be to explain the congressional reconstruction policy that created military reconstruction. And then if you could do it, I would just say you were wrong. Or I would lose your application or your test or that sort of thing. So the voter registrars were they're controlled by local and state governments, and they could really vary their policies a lot. That's why you see in the civil rights movement some voting rights acts that make the process of registering to vote much more standardized and federally controlled, because that's the way that Southern states kept people from voting, was how they administered literacy tests. I read somewhere that Rosa Parks had to take hers 3 times, and she was an educated woman, and she passed the 3rd time because she had a lawyer with her who observed while she took it and submitted. Yeah. Poll taxes, a tax on voting. So every time you voted, you're supposed to pay a tax. This will keep you from voting if you're poor. And then you're thinking maybe, well, I know there's a lot of really poor and not educated white guys in the South, and you would be correct. So every Southern state had a grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause said if your grandfather could vote before the Civil War, then you are exempt from the literacy test and the poll tax. That's why there's a constitutional amendment preventing a poll tax, because it was a tactic used to keep Black voters from voting. And so the grandfather clause exempted you, not because, that there were mixed race slaves, that there were, but their birth records only listed their mothers. So there's no way that they could prove that their grandfather was a white man. No way they could prove it. So this exempted voters from poll taxes and literacy tests if their grandfather, not grandmother, their grandfather could vote before the Civil War, since slave lineage is traced through the mother, and only the mother's listed on the birth records. And then you just had the KKK doing their thing. And eventually, voters, if they could pay the poll tax and pass the literacy test, if that was allowed, because, it was rigged, there are times you had to decide, would I rather live or vote? And most people pick live. So there's so many reasons that African American men in the South stop voting. And when the federal government stops protecting African American voters in the second Grant administration, you start to see much less Black participation in voting, because it's either impossible or it's dangerous or both. Yeah. All right. So as the period of Reconstruction, well, they didn't know it was ending, but as Grant's second term ends, it's very clear Grant's not running for another term. And I know people don't typically run for more than 2 terms, but that's tradition, not law at this point. It's law now. So the next guys who are going to run are Samuel Tilden and Rutherford Hayes. Hayes is the Republican, Tilden's the Democrat. They're both Northern guys. No reason to think either of these guys are terribly dishonest, but both political parties are. And it appears that Tilden won the popular vote and the Hayes won the electoral vote. There are some disputed states. Both parties send people to help count in those disputed states. And both parties come up with a recount that says that they won all the states. If the Republicans won all of the disputed states, excuse me, I'm out of water. If the Republicans won all of the disputed states, they would win in the Electoral College. Because the recounts are all disputed as well, they decide to send the election to the House of Representatives, which is constitutional. That's completely a legitimate thing to do. But the House, excuse me, the House is primarily Republican. So to make it fair, they decide they'll set up a committee 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent, which kind of means one guy is going to choose the president, and the independent is not on the committee. He's replaced by a Republican. So 8-7, they decide that Hayes should be the president. And in the southern states, I think it's Florida, South Carolina, and maybe Illinois where the disputes were. I know your book says, I just don't remember off the top of my head. Excuse me. So South Carolina says, this isn't fair. If you do this, we're going to secede again. And there's all sorts of turmoil. And so Congress and the states Congress comes up with what is referred to as the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 has a few provisions. Hayes will be president, so Republican, Northern kind of dude. The South or the Democrats will be allowed. There'll be a Southern Democrat on the cabinet. I think the one they pick will be the postal commissioner. But they'll also fund a railroad from Texas to California, which will help Southern commerce quite a bit. But the main thing you can see highlighted here is the end of military reconstruction. So all of the 5 military districts that governed, until the Southern states ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, which they never did, those are removed. So each state gets to conduct its own elections however they want. They don't have federal oversight anymore. And this means that Black voters are not going to vote again. Now, Reconstruction ends with the Compromise of 1877. So really from 1877 and on, so presidential election 1880, up until about, I would say 1964, probably more correctly in 68, because you have a Voting Rights Act in 64, but it's right before the election. But until the end of the 1960s, you don't see voter participation of African Americans in the South rise again. You don't, because it's not safe, it's not protected. So this kind of leads you to the discussion of the successes and failures of Reconstruction. Sorry, I was just peeking to see what notes are down here. There's probably not any. So yeah, this is your question. I think the other questions I in the longer semester, I made them answer all the questions. So. Sorry, but you already know that's your question. All right. Goodness, all the coughing. I think probably, excuse me, it's maybe a fairly good place to stop. Now, as far as is Reconstruction a success or failure? We'll talk about this tomorrow. We'll talk about all this stuff tomorrow because we're really kind of done with content, but tomorrow will give us a chance to hit the highlights of things that'll be on the quiz and also talk about the 3 questions in a little more depth. But if you're answering the is Reconstruction a success or failure, you want to mention military reconstruction in there somewhere. You want to mention Freedmen's Bureau, I think. African American men participating in government, voting, that kind of thing, because those things are successes. And of course, the amendments 13, 14, and 15. Failures, it's failure to carry out Reconstruction beyond the Grant administration. The lack of zeal to continue it in the second Grant administration, lack of protection for Black voters, failure to redistribute land or assets of any sort. What you hear of in the modern era is reparations. Certainly this is the generation where reparations could have made a profound difference in the outcome of this push for equality. I'm not I'm not discussing them in the modern era or saying it's a good or bad idea now. I am saying that, they started doing some land redistribution. There was evidence that it was successful and it was leading to economic independence for former slaves, but without resources and or education, without resources or education, um, it's going to be difficult to have economic success. And then, of course, you don't have the government protecting or enforcing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th a little bit more, but I mean, some of you mentioned too the idea of Jim Crow laws. They don't necessarily enslave somebody, but they sure restrict your freedom. And then, that codicil, that little part of the 13th Amendment that says people cannot be enslaved except as punishment for a crime. Yeah, you're going to see people arrested so that they can be used for manual labor while they're criminals, chain gangs, that sort of thing. So there's lots of stuff to discuss. I would encourage you not to see it as all positive or all negative, knowing that the end result is not going to be terribly positive, even though you do have a handful of folks who are incredibly successful despite the odds. And you have a foundation, a legal foundation for later. But I know we say that a lot in 1301, where, we don't have equality that's promised in this document or that amendment, but you have the foundation, so later on you can have it. And I know that seems a little hollow, maybe, and it certainly is for the people who lived during that time period. But that legal foundation, not every country has that, and not every country, I know we had a civil war to end slavery, I'm aware of that, but not every country has a part of their government that will eventually, come to the conclusion that equality means equality. Yeah. And I know it can be discouraging, especially if you watch the news, or I know, my younger students always like, oh, everything is crap. And I get it, because, the last several years have kind of looked that way. But I do think sometimes that some of the things in the documents and in the laws that we passed, maybe not knowing how they would be used, are still quite hopeful. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. And I know I don't know who the famous person was who said that we've really made no progress in civil rights. And I get that that's out of discouragement of the moment and the time period. But I think if you look, goodness, if you compare how life is now to how life was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, it is substantially better. So I think we're headed in the right direction thing. I know we're not there yet, but we got to keep going, right? All right, so I'll stop saying stuff like that. Hey, I stopped talking when I said positive things, or I stopped coughing when I said positive things. So before you go, let me double check the roll.